been with her for 7 years. We started with her when she started on the council in 2015. Yes, we're going to talk about redistricting today. Councilmember Silverman was honored, and I use that maybe a little sarcastically, to be the chair of the redistricting committee, subcommittee. It's technically a subcommittee of the council as a whole. But she is the chair of the subcommittee for the council. So our office is leading the redistricting efforts for this year. And that was a bit of a joke, but we do take it seriously. This is a serious process. It is an important part of democracy and how we make our democratic system, small d democratic system, more representative and more perfect, they would say. So I'm going to do a couple things, give a little presentation with some background and some process on redistricting, a little PowerPoint. And then I'm going to move over to our new redistricting tool that we have this year and show a little bit about how to use it. There are some trainings. If you want a real 2-hour training that's just focused on the redistricting tool, you can sign up to that. With that, the Office of Planning, who's our partner on the executive side, they are running some trainings and there's availability. We're starting them tomorrow, but some of them are filling up. There's a lot of availability next week, though, if you see my presentation and you want even more. There's only, I'm not a huge tech expert, so I'll show you the basics about how to use this tool, but there's probably some things I'm not going to be able to do it. And everything's virtual. All the trainings are virtual. It's a good question. On Zoom, or actually they're on Teams, they're not on Zoom. The executive side often uses Teams. But okay, and if you have any questions along the way, throw them in the chat, save them to the end, whatever you want to do. I am relatively flexible. All right, so let me pull up the PowerPoint. All right, so can everybody see a really garish, hideous looking PowerPoint presentation on screen? I'm not hearing that, so I'll assume you can. Okay. So redistricting 2021, get excited, we're redistricting. I did try to find the most ugly background I could find, really to wake you up from a less exciting process. All right, so what is redistricting? Why do we do it? Let's see, how many people are here? Does anybody want to write into the chat? Why do we need to redistrict? Make this a little bit interactive. My wife's a teacher, so she'd be appalled at the pedagogy that I'm using for this. But if anyone wants to write into the chat why they think why we need to redistrict, why we have to go through this kind of crazy process the whole time. Because of new census numbers, that is very literal. Yes, because of the new census numbers. As demographics change, it's the law, even more literal. The council appreciates when we follow the law. So we redistrict. The very theoretical reason to ensure representation. I'll take that one. That's a great one, Kim. To ensure representation, one person, one vote. You hear that a lot. One person, one vote. And there's a lot of meaning to that. I'm not a lawyer. There's probably some lawyers on here who explain more about that. But one person, one vote for redistricting purposes means we try to create equal size political jurisdictions. For us, that's mainly wards. You can also talk about advisory neighborhood commissions, but I'll mostly talk about wards. We want them to be about the same size. This, by the way, is a map of some old redistricting from, I think, 1822, the ward boundaries from way back then. I wasn't around back then, but it was a little bit maybe easier to draw the lines. They're kind of very rectangular, but ours will not be quite as rectangular. But one person, one vote, we want to ensure equal representation. equal sized wards for every council member. And one way to think about why that's important is, say this is a representation of a state and there's 10 people living in it. 5 red, 5 blue. If we split them up and say each red person, each red dot gets to be a ward or a congressional district, and all 5 blue dots can be one ward, one representative area, then that's not, no one would think that's fair. Each of the 5 red dots can elect one representative themselves, and the 5 blue only elect one. So that's unbalanced. So if you want to think about it, if you have very small, for DC, if you have very small wards, those people have a lot more power to elect representatives than a really big ward does. So in the past, the United States had some problems with this. Some places would be very, very small and some places would be very, very big. And that's just unrepresentative. Kind of a problem with the Senate too, but that's out of my jurisdiction. So moral of the story, we redistrict, we go through every 10 years, we get new census numbers, we find how many people are in the district and where do they live. And we try to make all the wards about the same population. And that's to ensure everybody has an equal opportunity of electing their representative. So that's basically why we redistrict. That's why we go through this every year. So someone mentioned it's the law, which is also true. So what does the law require? There's a lot of case law that I'm not really going to talk about. Again, not a lawyer. But there's literal stuff in the law that we got to follow. The most important one is it says the wards have to be substantively the same size. So it doesn't mean they have to be literally the same size at the end of this process. So I'll show some numbers later. It's about, I think, around 86,000 per ward. They don't have to be literally exactly the same amount. They can be plus or minus 5% from that 86,000 figure. So that's just taking the whole population of the district, dividing it by 8 for equal wards, and you get about 86,000. So we can be plus or minus. And I'll go to the numbers again in a minute. But so again, there's going to be some wiggle room. Some can be a little bit smaller than others. Some can be a little bit bigger. But right, functionally, we're trying to keep them around the same size. There is a timeline for us in the law. It's in local law, so we can always change it if we need to. Ward level redistricting must be completed 90 days after the census data is submitted to the council. So the census data was released earlier this month, around the middle of the month. And so we're hoping to get this done by about 90 days, mid-December. So we'll be adhering to that, again, plus or minus maybe a little bit. Might have a few more days just to kind of fit in with the exact council calendar. But again, 90 days is what we're looking for. Not a lot of time in the scheme of things. But it's actually better than some other states. Some states, as of today, have like 4 days to get it done. That's not a lot of time. The law does say the plan should not dilute the voting strength of minority citizens. That is I would say it's more complicated than it sounds. We're at our first rule is they got to be roughly equal size, plus or minus 5%. That's the ironclad, got to happen. And so also kind of mentioned later, mathematically, sometimes that's not always going to be possible to not dilute voting strength, or we need to have a discussion about what is voting strength. And then the last thing that's in the law, there's a few other things I'm not mentioning, but the other kind of big thing is when it comes to ANC redistricting, each ward council member will create a ward level task force to make recommendations for the ANC boundaries. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but basically some of you actually may have been involved in that. I have not, a few council members have. Councilmember Treon White, for instance, was on one, I believe, in 2011. But Each council member has a pretty wide latitude to create a ANC recommendation task force for people in their ward, make recommendations for ANC boundaries. So those are kind of the broad outlines. Again, the main thing, substantively same size, plus or minus 5%. That's what we're aiming for. So what's the timeline? We're having our first hearing on Wednesday. We encourage everyone to come testify. We're still accepting people come testify. On the council website, if you go look on the calendar on the council's website, dccouncil.us, go to the calendar, go to September 29th, you'll find our hearing notice and a link to go sign up to testify. Online, Zoom, we'll send you a link. So that's our first hearing, that's our kickoff hearing. Anyone can come testify about anything they want about the process, about where they think certain lines should be, anything like that. You think Shaw should be in Ward 2, Ward 5, Ward 6, whatever. Go ahead. Yes, Reese's put in a link in the chat for the hearing if you want to sign up. But anyways, if you have thoughts about where you live and which ward it should be in, you want to stay in the ward you're in, come testify. I think a lot of people here are pros at testifying at the council, so I think you get the drill. And then the next phase from that is we're going to start scheduling some ward level hearings. So one ward in each hearing. I've used hearings in quotation marks. They might be round tables technically. But the goal is we want to have one hearing or round table in every ward. We're trying to get as much input, feedback, thoughts as possible. We want a diversity of times. We know sometimes it's hard to come to a council hearing. It's easier now with Zoom, but not always possible for everybody at a certain time. So our goal is to have lots of different hearings. So these ward level ones, we're going to try to mix up the times, certain times a day, stuff like that. To give people ability, don't feel like you have to, if you live in Ward 8, don't feel like you have to go to the Ward 8 hearing. You can always come to the Ward 1 hearing, Ward 3, talk about Ward 8, that's okay. But anyways, we want to try to have at least one for every ward. And then we're hoping to have a final wrap-up hearing, full official hearing, in late October, maybe early November. We'll see. But that'll be a wrap-up. Everyone can come testify again if they want, but more opportunities for people to testify. Then again, we're a subcommittee. So we will be marking up our subcommittee draft in mid-November. That gives enough time for then us to report out to the committee of the whole. And we were a subcommittee of the committee of the whole, COW meaning committee of the whole. The COW will then be, I wrote down late November, December. That's kind of a whoopsie on my part. The COW meets at a very regular time, so they will be definitely meeting exactly on December 7th. So they'll be meeting to mark up on December 7th. The first council vote will also be on December 7th. And this is legislation, just like any other bill. It's not a resolution, which only gets one vote. It's legislation, so it gets 2 votes. The second will be on December 21st. It'll include, there'll be an emergency version of it, emergency and temporary for those who are familiar with our process. There's permanent legislation to permanently change the wards. We're doing an emergency alongside it at the same time. Emergencies go into effect faster, but for shorter periods. We need these ward boundaries in place ASAP. As I'm sure a lot of people know, the census was very delayed in sending out their census data. So we're kind of bumping up against, if you can believe it, the primary for next year. The primary is slated for June, but it's always good for people to know what ward they're in well before the primary. So we're getting this done December 21st in time to give the mayor 10 days to sign it. Fingers crossed, no veto. She'll sign it, and then it'll go into place. And with enough time for candidates to have declared, pick up petitions, and start trying to get on the primary ballot with knowing where they live. So that is the timeline. Maybe I'll pause here for a second just to see, is there any reason the primary can't be moved back a little if necessary? Yes, and yes and no. I mean, it can be moved back a little bit. It can't be moved back too far. There are people here who are probably much more familiar with election issues than I am. At a certain point, you kind of start bumping up into some federal election law issues, especially around, I think, military and overseas voters. There's only so far back you can really push it. So we could push it back a little bit, but again, we have that 90-day clock in law. Once we get the census data, we're abiding by that. That's around December, mid to late December anyways. So we're keeping to that December timeline. We think that's enough time for that. We are looking at the AOC timeline to see if we can get us a little bit more time for that process. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Yes, let's see. The question is about which wards have shrunk. Let me see, did I include that slide here? Yes, I will be getting to that in a minute. All right. So then a quick look at the ANC timeline. So again, the ANC, so how the district works with this, we do our ward level redistricting first, at the wards, and then we do ANCs. Some states do all of it in one go. We have a kind of bifurcated process, two-step. So once we're done with the wards, then we'll do ANCs. Those ward task forces that I mentioned, each ward council member will form their own task force of people in their ward. They got to live in the ward. Those will form in December. And then around February, they also have a clock. In February, those ward task forces will report out to the council, to the public. Here is what our recommendations are for the ANC within that boundary. So for instance, Ward 7 will have a task force, and that task force will be people who live in the new Ward 7. And they'll come together and they'll say, here's what we think the ANC boundary should be, both for the kind of big ANC and then for each single member district within the ANC. They'll make recommendations for those lines. So we will have that whole process. They'll be reporting that out in February. We'll then start having hearings, again, in March and April timeline. There'll be a whole set of hearings just on the ANC boundaries. And then the subcommittee will be marking up in mid-May. The CAL will be marking up in, again, I'm forgetting that the CAL meets in regular time, so it'll probably be either mid-May or early June. The CAL will mark up the ANC boundaries, and so then the first and second votes will be in the May or June timeline. Again, the issue there is we want to make sure the ANC candidates know which ANC they live in, so that they can pick up petitions to get on the ballot for the November election. So we can't move back the November election, but we can see if there's anything in the timeline there to give us a little bit more time. And that'll also have an emergency bill attached to it as well. That'll be put in place as soon as possible, May or June. John Totoli throws a question about same size, how big should the wards be? Going back to that plus or minus 5% question. I believe Chairman Mendelson has said in the past he likes them to be relatively close, really kind of spot on. to the average as close as possible. Councilmember Silverman has not made a decision on that. There's some pros and cons there. One thing to think about is development. I know Empower DC thinks a lot about development. You don't want to necessarily try to line up everything precisely for where they were a year ago. You may want to also think about where future development is going to be coming. So, for instance, Buzzard Point is one such place. There's a lot of development there, but it's not included in the 2010 census numbers. So you want to maybe think about there could be a few thousand more people living in Buzzard Point in the next 5 years, 6 years. So maybe you want to try to take that into account too. So no decisions have been made there. We welcome people who want to testify about that if you think we should be thinking about it a certain way. But that's a good question. That's something we are talking a lot about. All right, moving along. How can you access the census data? Census website, perhaps an obvious way. There's a lot of data in the census. If you can get really detailed about a whole bunch of different issues, different demographic data, stuff like that. So if you just go to the census website, it's actually relatively straightforward to access. There's something called census tracts. That's the smallest unit of measurement. That's the smallest unit of measurement that you want to, I mean, it's not the smallest, census block, but you try to keep census tract. You want to keep that as whole as often as possible. So you can go look up lots of data on the census website, or use our redistricting mapping website, which I'll be talking about soon. You can get a fair amount of demographic data from our mapping website itself. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Our website, elissasilverman.com/redistricting. We have links to a lot of information there. We also, from our site, link to the Office of Planning website. Office of Planning is doing some number crunching too. I'll actually be referring to one of their slides in a minute. They are, again, doing some number crunching and have some interesting data available from the census. And then also there's a lot of other websites out there. If you don't like our mapping website, that's fine. There's a few other redistricting websites out there. Not all of them actually have DC in them, which is still disappointing. They don't see us as a state worth bothering with, but some places you can go and do redistricting yourself. Just like with our tool, maybe it's a little more user-friendly. But there's other places you can go to look up census data. Okay, so someone asked, what does the data show for the wards? So this is a wonderful chart made by our Office of Planning. This shows the 2020 census data, population data, just total population. First district wide, so that's that top number. So we found, and by we I mean the census, found that there were just shy of 690,000 people living in the district in 2020. That's a little lower than we thought it would be. But such as that, that's what we got to work with. We have to use this data. And then here we have broken down for each ward what their population is or was as of 2020. And then the final column all the way to the right shows if they're within range or not within range. And so what that means, if you look at that note at the bottom, this is that plus or minus 5% that I was talking about before. You take that 545,000. That's the total population. Divide by 8 for the 8 wards. You get 86,193. That's the average. You divide by 8. So that's kind of, if you want to be spot on, you could make every single ward exactly, maybe not quite exact, pretty much 86, 193. And so then if you take 5% of that, that's about 4,300, plus or minus, that gets you the lower boundary for what's acceptable by law is 81,883. And then the top boundary is 90,503. So if you're within, 81.8 and 95, if you're within there, that ward is acceptable. It doesn't have to change. It could change. It doesn't have to change. So if you look at the data from 2020, the first 5 wards, not that we're sorting best to worst or anything like that, but numbers 1 to 5, those wards are within the boundary, within that plus or minus 5%. So you see Ward 2, for instance, is 81,904. They're like 20 people above the minimum. Good job, Ward 2. And counting, you got just over the threshold. But there's 3 wards who are outside of that plus or minus 5%. The big one is Ward 6. A lot of growth there, right? Within Ward 6 right now, you have the Wharf, Navy Yard, Noma is a big one. There's just been a lot of population growth in Ward 6, such that they're over that 5% threshold by another 17,700 people. That's a lot. They're quite a bit over. That means the boundaries of Ward 6 must by law shrink. Ward 7 and 8, on the other hand, are just under the 5% bottom threshold. They have to grow. Ward 7 by 5,628, and Ward 8 by 3,370. And remember, all 3 wards, that's just to get them within the acceptable boundary. Ward 6 could shrink more than that 17,000, as long as it doesn't go below the bottom. And then Ward 7 and 8 can grow. So for Ward 7, it can grow by more than 5,600. It can grow by 10,000. I'm doing my math right. But it doesn't have to. It just has to get at least up to that 81,000 number. So that's the kind of state of play. Ward 6, gotta shrink. Ward 7, 8 have to grow. The other wards, again, they could grow. So again, Ward 2, because it's just barely above the bottom threshold, so they could absorb quite a number of more residents. Their boundaries could grow. They don't have to. Carol has a question about the kind of accuracy of the census. That's a great question. Our Office of Planning is looking into that. I haven't checked in with them recently. I should do that. They are doing some, especially because our numbers were so low for what we thought they would be. She is, and by she, I mean Office of Planning, is taking a look to see how close are we, or how accurate are we, I should say.
Sam, do you mind addressing a comment that I made earlier? You referenced the use of future population to make decisions on redistricting, but I want to be very clear that that is illegal, that you can't say that because Buzzard Point will be building up in the next 5 to however many years, that that should somehow impact our decision, that it just doesn't work that way. And it would be illegal to do that.
I'm not a lawyer. I will defer to you. I will say again, our main thing is we got to be within plus or minus 5%. So that's what's in the law. That's what's been made clear to us. I won't argue with you on the legality of, as long as you're within that, what decisions can be made. But again, our key figure, plus or minus 5%. That's what we're going with. To Ann's and I think Gigi's question, our local law does say census numbers have to be used. Some states get a little more creative. They sometimes don't use census, they use other federal census numbers that are not the official census, but I haven't looked much into that. And so the question about the waterfront in Ward 2, are there any concerns for history in making adjustments? I think sometimes I would not be surprised if the council does think a little bit about, we want to have a respect for history, not make too many changes for the sake of making changes, if that's getting to your question. There's probably going to be something of a status quo bias. We're not going to be too radical with the changes. So the southwest waterfront could be moved to Ward 2. That's certainly an option. Ward 2 does have space to grow. Ward 6 needs to shrink. But that is up to the council members to decide. And John Cavosi has a question about Ward, to have 3 ward council members represent who live east of the river. Yeah, if the council members decide to do that, that is something that they could do. So I don't make the decisions, but that is certainly an acceptable thing. You can do whatever you want. Someone did concentric circles. He had a map that was concentric circles around Ward 1. So you can get very creative with your maps if you want. Okay, I'll keep moving along. So I think we want to get over to our mapping tool. So anyways, my point here with this map was just to show, again, like I said, Ward 7 and 8 need to grow. They need to, the boundaries need to grow. Both of them need to grow. And I'm told we can't absorb parts of Maryland into the district. So there's only so many places Ward 7 and 8 can grow. And a lot of that's in Ward 6, which needs to shrink. So I would just say, do not be surprised if Wards 7 and 8, a lot of the proposals that will be put forth will involve both Ward 7 and 8 crossing the river into what is it, Ward 6 and potentially Ward 5 right now. Just mathematically needs to happen. Parking. Parking is another major issue that comes up. It is a very thorny subject, and I will not make much of a comment on that other than to say the council members are well aware that some people have very strong feelings about parking. Our parking, as I assume most people know, our parking laws are, our parking boundaries are based on ward lines. There is some discussion among council members about separating that, about redoing the parking laws to create a separate parking system that's not connected to our wards. I think a lot of other big cities have done that. So my point here is just to say, I know a lot of people are very concerned about redistricting and parking. And that is something the council members are aware of and are actively debating. So there will probably almost certainly be people testifying about that on the Wednesday hearing. We encourage people to share any thoughts they have with us as well. And yes, Jeffrey had a question. Yes, lots of discussion about decoupling parking from ward boundaries, but that's going to take a little while. So no answers, probably won't be answers for a little bit, but it is definitely on the radar. Quick thing about the ward, a little bit more about the ward task forces, those ANC task forces. I think the key thing here, the law says they have to be registered voters. The members of the task forces have to be registered voters and residents of the ward. So that's why we do it after we settle the ward boundaries. Because people may be in different wards than they are right now. No, I think PSAs are their own separate thing. They're like, sometimes they're vaguely nearest wards, but our ward redistricting will not affect, yes, correct, police service areas will not be affecting, we will not be changing any police service areas or schools. We do get questions about schools. People have very strong feelings about school boundaries. This will not be changing school boundaries. That's one headache we don't have to worry about. at least for right now. So yes, got to be registered voters, residents of the ward. And again, in the law, it says council members should give full consideration to ensuring fair representation of all racial and ethnic minorities, women, in geographical areas in his or her ward. So you want to have a good geographical distribution and a good distribution of members that reflect the demographics of the ward. Also, the other wrinkle is every at-large. That's a great question, Sabrina. Get into that right now. Every at-large member of the council can appoint one person to each of the 8 ward task forces. So council members will be appointing one to each one. Other than that, there are no restrictions on the size of the task force, the composition of the task force, how often it meets, anything like that. So the law would allow a council member to have 2 members on the task force and meets once in their house. Maybe that wouldn't meet Open Meetings Act laws, but you get my point. There's no requirements over how big the task force has to be. It can't be larger than the population of the ward. So as long as it's smaller than the ward, you're fine. There is some debate about whether ANC members should be included, sitting ANC commissioners be included in the ward task force. The law allows that. I'll just put it that way. So that is a legal thing in our law right now. Someone asked, does CORE play a role in this process? CORE is the Council Office of Racial Equity. New this council period, the council is doing racial equity analyses of all legislation, almost all. There's a few things like the budget that are exempted. There will be a racial equity analysis of the redistricting law, of our new proposal that we put out. So we've been working closely with the office, the council's Office of Racial Equity, to start thinking through what that would look like. And they will be producing a report on this. But we're also trying to work with them up front to have, again, an open and inclusive process. As open one as we can, to try to make sure that we get it right on the front and don't just have a report at the back end. And the report will be coming out for, I believe, for the subcommittee's markup. So that'll be in mid-December. The other kind of wrinkle on the going back to the ward task force is the ANC ones. None of them are paid according to law. Kind of like ANC members. And then just a reminder of the timeline for the ANC process. Those task forces should be reporting out around February, and then eventually moving to a vote for the full council in May or June. If there's no other questions, I will move over to the mapping tool. We'll pause for a minute. I'll take a sip of water. Okay. You can still ask questions, but let me move over to show everyone how to use the mapping. I have too many screens open, my apologies. Okay. So can everybody see a kind of blue screen with the Wilson building on in the background? And then this website's open now if people want to go to it too. They can play around with it on their own. So this is the landing page, pcredistricting.esri. Esri is the company that makes this, esriemcs.com. If you do that, you don't need the redistricting / redistricting at the end, but it gets you here. This is the landing page you'll start at. If this is your first time coming to it, you need to create an account. You just kind of go there, create an account, put in the information it asks for there. That's relatively straightforward. I already made an account, so I will go ahead and log in. Okay. And again, I'm going to kind of give a broad overview of this. I won't be talking about all the features. It is a relatively powerful tool if you want to get very granular and do a whole bunch of stuff. I'm only going to show a high-level view of it. So this is, you'll get to this landing page. You're given two options: starting template and blank template. I will say you will, the easiest path forward is the starting template. The starting template gives you a map of the current 8 wards, the current boundaries. But you don't have to use that. If you prefer to start just with a blank map, you can choose the blank template. I strongly encourage people to do the starting template if they have it, if they want to. Just a little bit easier. Anyways, it's easier, but you are free to use the blank template too if you want. It's the same tools, but I think it's just a little bit easier to do the starting template. So I'll show what that looks like. Okay. So you get to this. This is what it looks like. Let me move some stuff around. So up here at the very top, you'll have a few options. You can create a new plan up top. That gives you the blank template. Open a plan button is a good way. That's how you go back. It brings up the open plan section, and you can get back to that first starting template or create a plan view. And then there's some save buttons. The big ribbon here up top, this is kind of how you navigate around your different options. I'll go through that in a minute. You'll have a mapping window here. This shows the map that you interact with. And then down below, you'll have a table showing numbers and population numbers. This is set up again showing the current wards. So it's broken down wards 1 through 8. Unassigned means if there's any parts of the city that are not assigned to a ward. You could be, as you're drawing different wards, you could unassign something from a ward. But right now, we're dealing with a starting template where every piece of the city has been assigned to a ward. So that's why they're all zeros. But you get a column for the total population for that ward. Target deviation, that's how much it deviates from the target. So you can see, and that target is the bang on average. That's not necessarily that lower 5% figures is the average. And then you have the white population, black population. There's a whole bunch of different demographic data down there that you can look at. Probably for right now, I'm actually going to hide that. Just give a little more space for map, so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so when you look at the map, you can move it around, zoom in and out. Again, if you're using the starting template, you'll see labels for all the wards. The numbers below it are the population of that ward. So what it is as you play around with it. So as you add or shrink a ward, or add people, take people away from a ward, that number will grow or shrink. White on the label means it's within the acceptable boundaries. Red means it's over. Red means it's under. So you want to end up with all of them being white. No green or red labels. That's kind of the goal. Let me go back up to the bar up here. So the first tab you get is File. This is where you open and save things. You'll see there's kind of two save options. One is save and one is save local. Save local is if you want to save it onto your own personal computer, save a plan. That's a thing you can do. You can then open a local plan. I've never done that and save it to the cloud, but that's something you can do. You can save stuff to your computer. Otherwise, you can save something. This is the template plan, so I would do save as, and you can just name it whatever you want and put it in description. You can put in whatever you want there. Good to put in a plan name that means something to you, but you are free to name it whatever you want and put in whatever description you want. Print, I've actually found helpful if you want to print out your plan so far. You can do that. You can also have it kind of without any of the geography or streets or anything like that. Mine's not working, but if you hit the map properties button, you can change the properties of that map. But anyways, if you go to the print, you can print stuff, print out maps, should you want to do that. The plan book just gives a little more detail about each of the wards that you do for printing. The Learn tab, the next one over, has a little bit of information about how to use the tool, and we'll go into that. That's what we're doing now. View, I won't talk about it as much. It gives you a little bit of information or different ways to show things and to change how the map looks. We have locked the number of districts on this starting template. We got to have 8 wards. That's the law. Someone already submitted a map with 12. If you start your own map with a blank template, you can change that number. Someone, like I said, someone submitted one with 12. We're only going to do 8 wards. So, sorry, that's what we're stuck with. So anyways, that's the View tab. Create is really the one you want to use. That's how the sausage gets made. A couple questions. ANC information will be available after we finish the ward level maps. So look back in December. Will we split blocks? If you mean like street blocks, probably not. We're going to try to maintain census tracts where possible. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Can you create multi-member wards? No. Not in this. Sorry. Okay, so the Create tab, this is where the magic happens. So again, there's a few features here I won't go into. The main one you want to think about is this redistricting thing kind of section here. The first place you start here is this district tab within here. It says unassigned. And then these down here are some of the tools. So what you're doing, essentially what you're doing is you are kind of selecting a tool and then saying which ward you're affecting. So let me show you what I mean. These over here is how you can also zoom in and out if you want. I know Ward 7 has to grow and Ward 6 has to shrink. So say I want to grow Ward 7. And don't take anything that I'm about to do. This is not official subcommittee action. This is just for illustrative purposes. So you go here, you select Ward 7. I want to grow Ward 7. And then I'm going to choose this one, this little one. This first arrow says what I click on, I'm assigning that to Ward 7. So as I click, I'm assigning that census tract to Ward 7. And I'm taking away from Ward 6. So you can go boom, keep going. As you see, the Ward 6 and 7 numbers are changing. So now Ward 7, the box is white, meaning it's now met the threshold. It's above threshold. It's good to go. But anyways, I'll keep going. You just kind of see I can move tracks from Ward 6 to Ward 7. These other buttons are just changing kind of how you do that. This next one, you do it by drawing a rectangle, and it's all the tracks touching that square move into the board. And then if I'm like, oh, see, I've gone way too far. Now Ward 7 is much bigger. Ward 6 is too small. Ward 6 is in red. Ward 7 is in green. So another way you can do it is you can draw a little polygon with this, and you can say, no, I want, and then I'll change it. I got to change over to Ward 6. Now I want to assign things to Ward 6. So now I'll draw a new polygon. I'm starting to assign them to Ward 6, back to Ward 6, and I'm drawing a little polygon. And now I've really screwing things up. But anyways, now I assign them to Ward 6 because I here selected Ward 6. So they're moving, anything in there is moving to Ward 6. You can also undo. So I made some boo-boos here that I didn't want to do. You click the undo button, you can start undoing what you drew, or redo it. You can also lock or unlock geographies. So if you're like, this place is perfect, I don't want it to move, even by accident, you can start locking them. You see they kind of develop this little hashtag. So that means they're locked. They can't be changed. Those will always be for Ward 7 unless I go back and unlock them. And then these little, what are those called? Binoculars. Those binoculars they take you to unassigned geographies if you have any that are unassigned. So again, if you're like, I don't know what to do with these geographies over here, these tracks, I'm going to unassign them. I'm going to keep them out of Ward 6 and Ward 7. But then if you're like, wait, I did that somewhere and I don't remember where, the map will take you. It'll pull up a list of the unassigned geographies, and you can zoom into them. Okay. And then this little hand here, by the way, that lets you move the map around without assigning geographies. Okay. And then this little tool here, the selection thing, it lets you select which level of geography you're dealing with. Apologies, my 2-year-old's running around. So if you hear any, she's climbing up the stairs. So you may have a small interruption. Oh, apparently my 2-year-old is bringing me something. Maybe it's a new ward map. Anyways, that is the kind of important part of the create feature. Oh, I'm getting a little snack. Take a break.
While you're while you're doing that, I wanted to just poll the group. Has anybody here submitted a map or is planning to submit a map? Can you indicate by one of your symbols or doing something in the chat? Is anybody submitting a map or planning to or hoping to? Chris Williams, anybody else? Paula Edwards, okay, planning to. Tyke James, oh good, okay. When we open it up for discussion, I would love to hear if anybody is, representing a community that you're actively looking at this, you think it's really going to impact your community, or you have some, some concerns or something that you want to sort of just raise for, at least for our awareness, as we go into the hearing process. I think it's important for us to be aware of, especially the communities that look like they're going to be most impacted in Ward 6, 7, and 8, to hear what you all are thinking. So I want to open it up in just a second. Sam, was there anything else you wanted to cover before we open it? We're at 7, so I want to just look at time.
Real quick, let me do 2 more things here. The review tab, this just lets you check the plan to make sure it's legal, in that there are no unassigned geographies. So we want you sending us a map that has everything assigned. So you can check that here. That's the integrity thing. It just makes sure I'm going to fail it. It's unassigned some things, but it makes sure everything is within the boundaries, and there's nothing unassigned. So I failed the null assignment check and the maximum deviation check, because I didn't do my job. You can also get some reports generated of demographics of each new ward that you did. You can share. I'm not really talk too much about share. I don't think people are going to be using it that much, but you can. There's different ways to share the maps you draw through the tool. And then the big one, I'm not going to be able to do it because I haven't done a correct map. You can submit a plan. It's relatively straightforward. Once you go from here, I haven't even saved my copy, so I can't even begin to share it. But this is how you submit plans to us, to the council, to the subcommittee. So this, we think, is a really great way for people to share their maps, their proposed solutions for redistricting. Send it to the subcommittee. We're already taking a look at them. There's already been maybe 40 submitted, including by some people here. We're taking this seriously. We want to see what people want the council to do. So we'll be sharing them with the full council. We're looking at ways to make them public to everybody in an accessible way. So that's why we like this tool better than others that are out there. Is this, you can use them, submit them officially to the subcommittee, to the council. And we think that's really powerful. So anyways, that is it. That's the end.
Okay. One question, Sam, before we open it up, can you clarify the status of the census data? Is it finalized, or are we still looking at, because you mentioned that OP was looking at, accuracy. So what's the implication of that?
I think that's unlikely to change anything. Like I said, I don't remember the status of it. They had said they were going to do that. I haven't checked in a little while. I severely doubt there'll be any significant changes. I could be wrong.
Okay, and with regard to the provision around assuring that the voting strength is not diluted for different ethnic and racial groups, how are you all considering that? Or have you, what have you looked at as some guides around that? Or are you kind of leaning on the core report to maybe shape some of that? Or what do you think?
Not necessarily the report, but we're talking to their office about that, about how to think about it. It's a complicated topic, and we understand that. So we want to have a very public conversation about what does that part mean. It just, because there's, like I said, as you look at Ward 6, 7, and 8, that's where most of the changes will be. And there's different ways to make that happen. Different ways for Ward 7 and 8 to grow into 6 or other parts of the city. And there's, different ways to add. You could try to keep Ward 8, for instance, if Ward 8's coming across the river. You could be looking to move different parts of Ward 6 to try to maintain the racial composition of Ward 8 as it is now, or make it more diverse. But there's different consequences for both, for which way you go. If you're keeping the kind of population same, or reducing the share of the Black population. And so we want to talk to the community about that. how does that language in the law, which is not very clear, what does that mean? How should we be thinking about that? So we're trying to talk to a lot of people to figure that out.
I just also wanted to clarify when we talk about, are we talking about representation or voting strength? Because, you know, not everybody is eligible to vote, but they're still counted in the census, right? So folks who are undocumented or maybe non-citizens and not eligible to vote are still counted in the census. I mean, the numbers may not be accurate. I don't know how many of our returning citizens, I don't know if everybody still has the right to vote, but just to be clear, they're closely linked, but not exactly the same, right? voting strength and representation.
That's true. You are correct. So the census data counts bodies, not voters or registered voters. So the census data and what we go by is just who was physically or who says they live here.
And that includes children.
Includes children. It's everybody, age 0 to however old people are in the district, 100 plus. So, I mean, your point is a good one. I mean, one of the big things we think about a lot is Ward 8. You have the military base here along the river. There's like 5,000 people who live there who are counted in the census, but I don't think a lot of them vote.
Vote here. That's right. Yeah, non-registered. Yeah.
So that, you know, that changes the numbers and how it works. So we are basing our decisions on the census data, the population data, but we also want to be cognizant of issues like that as we think about things.
Okay, so I'm going to open it up, and I did want to see first, was there anybody who wanted to speak to a potential impact on their community specifically? So I could get a sort of show. I'd like to call on those. I know I have Chris Williams. Was there anybody else also? I just want to get this stack real quick. Anybody else wanted to speak? And Sharon Wise. Okay. All right. Why don't we start with Chris and then Sharon, and then I'll put another call. Sam, if you can take your screen down, I think Chris had something he wanted. Chris, I will. Yeah, that's good. Chris, I will give sharing power because I know you made a map, I think, right? Did you make a map? Let's see. Here we go. Okay. Chris, go ahead, but don't take too long because we got other people I want to hear from too.
Okay, I appreciate it. But one of the things that I really want to make clear that I don't think has really come across today is that we need to get real about what this process is about. It has major implications for racial equity, for health, for economic well-being. Given that the ward representatives are so influential in this city. I mean, there's a case of the Shakespeare Theater in Southwest where there's a difference between Chairman Mendelson and Ward 6 Councilmember Allen. And the chairman decided to default to the ward member. And so now we have this huge development in our community that we don't want. But there are, of course, other areas of the role and responsibilities of the ward representative that has major implications for that ward. And depending on how we draw our district, it could really decrease political power for minority groups. And I'll show you that in a moment, even if they're organized like we are in Southwest, even if they protest like we've done in Southwest. And we've seen what poor policies around political representation really has done. And what we're talking about here is historic racism in the way that low-income districts cannot include wealthy white neighborhoods. And here it harkens back to Sam's comment that Ward 7 and 8 need to grow. Well, there's a reason why they've been in that position. And the issue of our wards east of the river has been a long-standing issue. Here is a quote from former Mayor Marion Barry. We should really be concerned on how we treat minority populations in areas that are west of the river, because these are the areas that are experiencing the greatest gentrification and neighborhood change. And so let's return again to Sam's example. So if we have to carve out 3 districts, what's the most vulnerable group? What's the group that likely gets the least equal representation in voting strength? It's this group here. And so that's how we can think about some of the minority populations that are placed in areas of the city like Ward 6, where they see their political power, they see their self-determination declining over time. In Southwest, we've experienced this firsthand. We've had to protest against environmental racism. Recently, we had to protest about public housing conditions. Our neighborhood is largely being left behind, as has been mentioned by our ANC commissioner in the Washington Post. So here's an effort to really try to advance racial equity. The city says that it's very concerned about racial equity. Well, we need to apply it to the way we draw our districts, and we really need to think about what are the vulnerable communities and how can we promote the kind of economy and society where everyone has an equal opportunity. So those are my brief remarks. Thank you, Parissa.
Okay, Chris, thanks for your thoughts on that. Sharon, you want to unmute and go ahead, share your comment briefly?
Yes, my comment briefly is that we can philosophicalize, which isn't a real word, folks, so don't go look it up. We can philosophicalize all we want, but until those hard, real, official numbers from the census come out, we can draw as many maps as we like. As far as the economic, equity in different neighborhoods, we're going to see those neighborhoods change, but just by virtue of what we're seeing now, and specifically where I live in Ward 8. Ward 8 and Ward 6, you might as well look to see if your baby's going to be cute or ugly, because you're going to get married, and at some point, part of Ward 6 is going to come over here. Now, I've been saying it for 4 years, and people have said, oh, no, we'll never get that part. But the census is what is going to tell the true story. And that's really what I wanted to say. And my issue is that with all of like now, you got these different wards 1, 3, 5, 7. You have different wards where there are going to be political action happening at large seats coming up, the Elissa seats and Nita Bond seats. If these lines aren't drawn, then I'm going to end up voting for someone, ANC seats. I'm going to end up voting for someone who doesn't necessarily represent me, because I don't know where the lines are going to be drawn. So my thing is that all the work that's going into this, the committees for the redistricting, they're meeting way into the 22s, where you've got people now saying they're going to be running for a particular office. How you know those people are even going to be in that area, that district, that ward to run, if the lines are drawn a little bit over one way or the other? In closing, I want to say 10, 11 years ago, when the last census happened, I used to live in Ward 7. But because the lines were redrawn, I now live in Ward 8. I had nothing, no matter how many maps I drew, no matter how much I wished it didn't happen, but it did happen. So we have to wait for those numbers and stop all of this not stop, but just kind of start to scale back that pre-planning about what we're going to do until we know exactly where we're going to live.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, I think it would be helpful to hear from some of the folks who have gone through redistricting and been impacted by it, how it did affect you, just so we can be maybe mindful of things, the direct impacts that we may not be aware of. John, I see your hand up.
I went from having good polices coming by when we called them. I went from the parking situation. I went from the amount of taxes people pay, and within one line being drawn 1 inch over, I went from being able to have a home phone to having to have fiber optics or Fios, because we couldn't use copper wires on this side. People really need to understand the impact of what happens when your neighborhood is no longer your neighborhood, and what the difference a day make when that line is drawn. And now that's all I have. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, thanks, Sharon. I appreciate it. And I think there may be a couple other people also who've experienced it. John, go ahead, and then we'll get some more voices. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Parissa. And Sam, thanks for the great presentation, because I had no idea of some of this. And I have been through this, I guess, 1990, 2000, 2010. So having seen this, I agree with everyone on this political part. is what I really care about as much as anything else. The census numbers aren't really going to change that much if they, so that's one thing I would caution people on. It's not like we're going to find 8,000 more people somewhere in the city that they didn't find. But more importantly, on the political part, the voter rolls of this city are completely inaccurate. And I think, Sam, that's something I need for you guys to look at, because if we had, so I went door to door in Ward 2 during the recall. Every person who was on the list before, let's say 2018 or 19, they were gone. And so I'd say about a third of the voters that I actually found were actually on the list. So about 30% of the people on this voter rolls throughout the city, because we have a transient city, right? They're not here anymore. They moved, et cetera. So the point is that if we're worried about political power, if we're counting all these people we think are voters in certain areas or wards, they're just not here anymore. And so, beyond anything we're doing, I think we really need to look at that, because I am concerned with how it goes. The reason I put in the question about Ward 6 and 7 is really related to the idea that, when we had 3 people representing east of the river, there were 3 council members that cared about us. I ran for council in 1997, Ward 6, that represented east of the river, as well as, where it is now. And the fact is that meant I had to go east of the river. I had to care about those issues if I was going to get elected, right? Well, that's no longer the case anymore. And so when you say that the wards have to shrink or grow, I wish we could look at it a little bit more in terms of we need to change the wards. We need to look at maybe a more radical definition of like fixing this problem of, if Ward 7 and 8 go across the river, that still means we're only going to have 2 council members representing east of the river. And then also they'll be representing people on the other side of the river, which means they're going to be even less involved possibly and have less power. So that's a little bit longer than I wanted to go, but I do want to point out that we can change the boundaries. We don't just have to fix some, numbers game. We can actually change the wards to represent people in the way we want and give political power and, and do that. Because last time that's the case, that's exactly what happened. Ward 6 no longer represents people east of the river. And I can tell you, look at the corridor on Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast. East of the river, it's changed almost non-existently. If you just go across the bridge where Barney Circle is, Potomac Avenue Metro, it's completely changed in the last 10 years. So just that one extra mile, that one boundary change really did affect us here.
Sam, are you all looking at all at the distribution of registered voters as you look at the distribution of just population? Because what if you do have, an area because of the bases and different things, or just like there's a ton of new people in Ward 6, but they're maybe few of them are registered to vote in DC. I don't know. Are we looking at that at all? No.
Yes. So I want to be clear, we're not making necessarily our final decisions based on that, but it's something we're concerned about and want to be aware of. The way I would put it is, so if you remember, Ward 8 has to add like 3,400 people or so, but it could add a lot more. It could add to about 8,000-9,000, something like that. And the last election, the last primary in Ward 8, Councilmember Trayon White won with 5,000 votes or something like that. Not by 5,000 votes, but with 5,000 votes. So if we moved 8,000 people, if we're taking them from Ward 6 and putting them in Ward 8, we're not moving them physically, but if we're changing the boundaries, 8,000 people, that could have a material impact on an election. So I'm not saying that in that I'm saying we want to protect Councilmember White, but we don't want to protect him. And again, we're not making decisions. Our main goal is we got to be plus or minus 5%. But when we're thinking about that other council law, or not council law, the law that says we don't want to be diluting minority voting strength, that's something to think about. Ward 8 does have less turnout than other wards. So that's just something that we need to be considerate of and thinking of as the council makes its decisions. That makes sense.
Yeah, and could you also address the ANC boundaries? I did hear from somebody about concerns that members of the task forces may have conflict of interest, especially if they're ANC commissioners who are seeking re-election. So is that just completely up to the ward council member who's on the task force? How is that considered?
Under current law, yes, it is. So that is not something the subcommittee can prevent. That's what's in law. So the council could change that. They could pass a law, but current law, it's allowed. ANC members, sitting ANC members can be on the task forces.
The law that governs this is where? Is this like in the Home Rule Act, or is this legislation that could be
I mean,
amended?
you can always pass a law that I can't give you the quite exact code citation right now, but I'm happy to send it around. We can legislate. My understanding is you could legislate that, prevent it. But I'm not a council member, so I think that's about as far as I can go, but it's entirely up to the council. That is something that could happen.
Okay,
Ann
Okay.
Hoffman asked me to comment on Capozzi's idea. I think she's referring to the 3 council members east of the river. I was thinking, I mean, this whole thing is complicated. It's much more complicated than you would think. There's no easy answer on a lot of this. So I totally understand where Capozzi's coming from, that if you have 3 members representing east of the river, you can make an argument. Now there's 3 people who care about that area instead of 2. But there's also a flip side. Now, I mean, that's kind of the definition of what's called cracking and gerrymandering. We haven't really mentioned gerrymandering because that's usually a partisan thing. And there's not a lot of partisan differences on the council or in the city. But, you know, one way to break up what's called a community of interest, that's the legal term, community of interest. One way to break up a community of interest is to weaken it, is to split it into different legislative districts. So, you know, Republicans, Democrats do it too sometimes, but, you know, Republicans could put a core group of Democrats into multiple different legislative districts to break up their power. So, you know, I understand where Capozzi is coming from. A flip side to be concerned about is you could be breaking up a neighborhood, a community of interest. And whereas before they could have a united voice, one council member, maybe now you're splitting up an area and kind of diluting its power, its representation across multiple legislative districts. So I'm not saying Capozzi's wrong. I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying it's always more complicated than you would think. It's like, there's not a one size fit all answer to any of this. It's like really neighborhood by neighborhood, case by case. You got to kind of really think through what you're doing.
Yeah, and Sam, just not to respond, but I would say that if you look at the Kingman Park neighborhood, which is west of the river, but is part of Ward 7, what happened during redistricting was that the council member at that time who represented them in Ward 6 just didn't like the fact that they complained a lot. And guess what? No longer complaining in Ward 6 because now they're in Ward 7. So, you know, whether you agree with that or not, they're no longer in Ward 6, they're in Ward 7 based on redistricting. So that was the effect, but that's, you know, that's sometimes what we, you know, comes up in this that has nothing to do with anything you've talked about up to now, you know, in terms of numbers and, you know, equity and rate, you know, the equity of the wards being the same numbers and everything. It just has to do with politically, what do people want to do and what do they want to accomplish?
And then I see Sandra's hand. Ann, did you want to add?
Yeah, I just thought if you created 3 districts that have people east of the river, they'll have many, many more white voters in them. So you may very well be totally eroding the blacks' voting strength. So that was my concern about Capozzi's plan. Because we did lose more black people than white people, got a whole lot of new white people. It's going to be hard to maintain the power of the black voters.
Thank you. Sandra, you can unmute and share your comment.
Hi, my name is Sandra Gilbert, and I am the ANC in 6A07. Mr. Capozzi is correct. Kingman Park was a part of the Rosedale community. And so in 2011, they came for us. And we were pretty loud over here too. And they came, when they redrawn the lines, they came down my street. So if I walked out my door and crossed the street, I would have been in Ward 6. And at that time, and it still exists this time too, we had 1 Black ANC commissioner and 8 white ANC commissioners. So they came into our community, they split the community. Here we go again. I am on the chopping block. And I want to understand, we're talking about redrawing maps and everything. It appears, are the numbers only coming from Ward 6? Can we push some around 2 and 5 and push 5 into 7? Because my community is on the chopping block. It is an underserved Black community. And by moving us, and I'm saying this, I do not want the easy fix, the council to choose the easy fix and put all the Black communities in Ward 7. And I've seen some of the maps, and that's what they're aiming at. Ward 6 should not be a wealthy ward, and the haves have it, and the nots are nowhere in the city. I want to be a part of Ward 6. I want to be able to use my vote to make a difference. And I want to make sure that the wealthy, the middle class, and the poor are served equally and represented. And I've been trying to get support from my community, and I have not received it in quite a long time. So my concern is I want the city council to be creative and finding a way not to touch Rosedale, not to shut the voices up. And that is what I think. We are on the chopping block. And even though the process may appear to be what they say fair, I don't believe that. I don't believe we're going to get a fair shot. And I have to say that because I was a part, what John was talking, Kabosi was talking about, I was at all those meetings. I was told to shut up and sit down by a city council member. And he told me, you are going to Ward 7. But I ended up going to city council. And when that day came, I was still in Ward 6. But I'm just saying, I am very concerned. And I know if we got all these members in Ward 6, we can move some numbers around, push some to 2, push some to 1, push some to 4, 5, 2, and 7. Give Ward 8 some of the wealth. Come on, if we're going to be fair, not use the low-income communities that have the lack of representation and economic power to push us over into struggling wards that need support and resources. So that is my concern. And I'm going to speak. And I'm going to speak on that. It is an issue of race and economics in this city. And I want to make sure that the Rosedale community and all other communities, and I border wards 5 and 7, that we have an equal opportunity and shot. I do not want to leave Ward 6. I want to be a part of that. I want to make a difference. And that's all. Thank you so much, Parisa. I really appreciate it. But that's my perspective on this matter. It is a racial issue.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Sandra, so how could we make it more fair? We want to have this to be an open, transparent, and fair process. So how could we make it more? I'm not saying it can't be more open and fair, but I'm legitimately asking. But
well, I have asked community members to use that mapping tool, and one of them did send me one, and I say, put the Navy Yard in Ward 8, give them some of the wealth. Because I know a lot of the wealthy don't want to go to Ward 8. That's realistic. We're going to be real here. They don't want to go to Ward 8. Push some of the numbers. The increase was in the Navy Yard, the Wharf, Noma, those areas. Wherever there was the increase, that's where the decrease should go. Move them to the other wards. Even though they have equal numbers so far, it doesn't mean that can't change. Move them, rotate the numbers, and rotate it down to 7. Do not come to Rosedale. That's all I'm asking in other communities, because what you're doing, if you come to Rosedale, you're making Ward 6 a white ward, a wealthy ward. We will only have the haves, and the nots will not be in the ward. That is my concern. And however you can do the stats, or however you can rotate it, rotate it. Because I'm tired of them coming to Rosedale. And like I say, they came down my street and they made a point. We want to shut you up. And to have the line come down my street, it was an affront to me. They were letting me know we want to get rid of you and get rid of you quick. So fair, it's going to be hard for me to believe that. So that's my point.
I totally hear you. Sorry, one last thing. Just, I mean, this is what we're struggling with. I totally hear you. Especially with that Rosedale's been kind of on that chopping block 2011 repeatedly. But this is what we're dealing with, what I was referring to with the law, that we need to refrain from diluting minority vote share. So if we just move only white people over into Ward 7 and 8, then we have an issue of potentially diluting the voting strength there for our Black communities and potentially just having them represented by white people.
But that's not the case, though.
Okay.
Ward 8 should have received a portion of that wharf in Navy Yard long time ago. It's only fair.
That's Councilmember Barry was pushing for that.
Politically, they have not given it to that ward. I don't want to get specific, and you know what I'm talking about. Folks don't want to go to Ward 8, and they have the power. They have the money to tell that city councilman, I'm not going to Ward 8, and they're not going. So if you do send the individuals who live in that area, and there are Black folks that live in that area, they aren't just predominantly white, but let's be fair economically, if we're talking about being fair to communities and wards, give some of that wharf over. And I said this, I talked to a reporter today, and I said, what councilman want a poor community? You got to worry about crime. Who want to worry about crime? Who want to be reporting that? But look at what Ward 8 and 7 have to deal with. They have to deal with crime, unemployment, all kind of issues. And some city councilmen don't have that issue. So I want it to be fair. And that's what I'm saying. Whatever you got to do, make the numbers equal, but make sure that the minorities and the people that are in underserved communities are not used as a quick fix. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm asking for, is a fair chance for our community. I've been representing the Rosedale community for 9 years. And I'm just tired of looking at us being overlooked by government agencies and politicians. And I'm tired of it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And obviously this is just the beginning of a conversation, not the end of it. I am glad that there's going to be the ward level roundtable. Sam mentioned there will be a roundtable in each ward. I don't know, Sam, if those will be in person or virtual or a combo, but
probably virtual.
Okay, well, trying to find some ways to make it as inclusive as possible of people who, may not have as much computer access. And I think, we can reconvene as these proposals are developed and see where Empower DC members feel strongly about, advocating. But I want to thank Sam for joining us and making himself accessible to this. And I want to thank everybody for coming. I don't want to hold you too late tonight because we're not going to solve all the issues tonight, but marinate on it and let's commit to continuing to engage. And anybody who would like to have a follow-up conversation with me about potential next steps, feel free to reach out to me so that we can think through that. Okay.
Will do.
Yes. Thanks, everybody. And don't forget, the hearing is on Wednesday. And I'm sure, Sam said that even though it says on there that you should have registered by today, he said they're still accepting folks. So don't hesitate to sign up or just watch the hearing, see what's going on.
And I included my email, srosenamy@dccouncil.us. Shoot me an email, any thoughts, concerns, happy to keep talking.
I'll reach out to you tomorrow, Sam.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. It was good to see you all. We'll continue the conversation. Have a good night. You can unmute and say goodbye to everybody.
Thanks, Parisa.
Thanks, Farisa.
Thanks,
This has been great.
Sam. Thanks,
Thank you.
Teresa, everybody.
Thank you.
Sam.
Here, everyone.